What if the person closest to you, your own queen, is secretly planning to destroy your children and steal your throne? A mighty African king loses his beloved first wife to illness. Heartbroken, he remarries on his counsel's advice. The new queen appears kind and gentle, but she's cruel, power-hungry, and sees his children as enemies. She starves them, cuts their rights, and plots in the dark. A loyal servant tries to warn the king, but she makes him doubt everything. To uncover the truth, the king makes a chilling plan. He fakes his own death, and lies in a glass coffin for 2 days, watching everything unseen. What he sees will shock you: the queen threatening the children, forging documents to seize power, and even cheating on his funeral expenses out of greed. Only one person stays truly loyal, sneaking food to the dead king in the night. Just as she's about to crown herself queen, something impossible happens. This ancient tale of betrayal and justice will keep you glued till the end. Who can you really trust? And how does the truth always come out? Stay till the final twist, you won't believe it. But first, if you love powerful moral stories like this, hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never miss a new upload. Subscribe please, let's grow together. Now, let's dive into the story. The kingdom had not always known grief. There was a time when the land breathed easily, when drums at dawn announced not war but harvest, and when the king's name was spoken with warmth instead of fear. He ruled from a stone palace washed in sun and dust, a man raised to power yet softened by love. At his side stood his first queen, a woman whose strength did not shout and whose authority did not need cruelty. She listened before she spoke. She bent to greet children at eye level. When disputes reached the court, people trusted her gaze more than written law. Together, the king and queen built a rule that felt personal, almost familiar, as if the kingdom itself were an extension of their home. Their 5 children grew within that atmosphere, laughing through palace corridors, chased by servants who pretended annoyance but smiled when no one looked. The people adored the queen not because she was flawless, but because she was present. She visited villages without ceremony, sat on mats instead of thrones, and remembered names long after faces blurred. The king watched her do these things and loved her more deeply each year, convinced that the gods had chosen her not only for him, but for the land itself. The illness did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, like a shadow stretching at sunset. At first, the queen tired easily. Then her laughter shortened, her steps slowed, and her once bright eyes carried a fog she could not explain. Healers were summoned from distant regions, their herbs bitter, their prayers long. Nothing worked. The queen knew before anyone else that time was turning against her. She began spending longer moments with her children, braiding hair with trembling fingers, whispering lessons that sounded like ordinary advice but carried the weight of farewell. At night, when the palace slept, the king held her hand and pretended not to notice how light it had become. When she finally died, it was just before dawn, the quietest hour. The king did not scream. He did not collapse. He simply stopped breathing for a moment, as though his body had forgotten how. The funeral shook the kingdom. Thousands walked barefoot to honor her. Drums slowed to a mournful heartbeat. The people wept openly, because they felt they had lost more than a queen. They had lost protection. After the burial rites ended and the crowds dispersed, the palace felt unbearably large. The king returned to the throne, but the throne no longer felt like power. It felt like punishment. Grief did not leave him gently. It hollowed him out. Days passed where he answered council questions without hearing them. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with memories he could not silence. The children noticed first. Their father, once attentive, now watched them as if through water. Meals grew quiet. Laughter faded. The servants whispered among themselves, afraid the kingdom was being ruled by a man still alive but no longer present. Among them was one servant who had served the first queen since her youth, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned. He moved through the palace with careful eyes, watching the king drift further into himself. Responsibilities piled up. Border matters. Trade disputes. Succession concerns. The council grew anxious, not cruelly, but practically. A kingdom, they argued, could not rest on sorrow forever. The children needed guidance. The court needed stability. Slowly, reluctantly, the idea of remarriage was placed before the king. He rejected it at first with anger, then with silence. To love another felt like betrayal. Yet exhaustion is persuasive. Over time, the weight of loneliness, combined with duty, weakened his resistance. When he finally agreed to consider another wife, it was not hope that moved him, but surrender. The woman chosen appeared harmless. She spoke softly. She dressed modestly. She bowed her head at the mention of the first queen's name. To the king, she seemed like rest. To the council, she seemed controllable. To the children, she seemed distant, polite, unreadable. The marriage ceremony was smaller, quieter, lacking joy but filled with expectation. The people watched carefully, unsure whether to accept or mourn again. The king told himself that peace could be rebuilt slowly, that love might grow from patience. What he did not see, what grief had blinded him to, was how carefully the new queen observed everything. She counted glances. She measured influence. She studied the children not as lives, but as obstacles. In the early weeks, she smiled and served food herself, earning praise. Yet when no one watched, her eyes hardened. The servant noticed small things. Portions shrinking. Whispers ending when he entered rooms. The first queen's chambers being rearranged without permission. None of it seemed dangerous alone. Together, they formed a quiet warning. The king, still aching, did not hear it. He believed he had survived the worst loss imaginable. He did not yet understand that grief had only prepared him for betrayal. The king told himself that peace could be rebuilt slowly, that love might grow from patience. What he did not see, what grief had blinded him to, was how carefully the new queen observed everything. She counted glances. She measured influence. She studied the children not as lives, but as obstacles. In the early weeks, she smiled and served food herself, earning praise. Yet when no one watched, her eyes hardened. The servant noticed small things. Portions shrinking. Whispers ending when he entered rooms. The first queen's chambers being rearranged without permission. None of it seemed dangerous alone. Together, they formed a quiet warning. The king, still aching, did not hear it. He believed he had survived the worst loss imaginable. He did not yet understand that grief had only prepared him for betrayal. The council grew impatient, pressing the king to secure the succession. Your children are young, they reminded him in carefully measured tones. The kingdom needs order, not mourning. Nights stretched longer for him as he pondered their words, feeling each suggestion like a weight on his chest. Finally, surrendering not to desire but to responsibility, he allowed the wedding plans to continue. The people murmured uneasily at the new queen's arrival, some recognizing ambition behind her composed smile, others seeing only what the king chose to see, a gentle companion to soothe a broken heart. She entered the palace like a shadow, soft on the outside, but with teeth hidden beneath her calm. In her presence, courtiers bent instinctively, sensing both charm and authority. She moved through halls that had once belonged to laughter and warmth, placing herself carefully between power and the people, planting the seeds of control one polite gesture at a time. The wedding itself was quiet, though every eye seemed to weigh the proceedings. The new queen knelt, bowed, and kissed the king's hand, her eyes scanning for weakness. She did not show fear of the past, nor reverence for grief. Instead, she studied the gaps grief had left in the palace, in the king, and in the children. The 5 young heirs watched her carefully, sensing the air change in subtle ways. One of them, the eldest, lingered close to the throne, trying to measure her intentions with the naive courage of youth. Another, younger and sensitive, clutched the servant's hand as though instinctively seeking protection. The new queen smiled at them all, a smile that could have been warmth but carried an undertone of calculation. She served meals, straightened beds, and offered kindness in public. Yet the servant noticed how she lingered over the documents she carried, whispering to herself, telling names, dates, and inheritance rights. It was a private mathematics of power, invisible to all except him. Soon, subtle changes began to unsettle the household. Portions for the children were reduced, gifts once freely given vanished, and the palace's generosity toward the heirs dwindled. The new queen found excuses to be alone with the king's advisors, offering quiet words that seemed benevolent but guided the flow of information to her favor. The servant shadowed her movements, sometimes too late to intervene, other times gathering hints he could not yet explain. The children complained quietly at night, whispering to each other about the meals that were smaller and the laughter that seemed to leave the walls. Yet they felt powerless. The king, preoccupied with grief and duty, noticed only fragments. He trusted the queen because she wore serenity like a garment, not realizing that every act of kindness hid strategy. The palace, once a space of open joy and conversation, began to feel like a cage with invisible bars. At the end of long days, the servant would retreat to the quiet corners of the palace, replaying what he had seen, wondering how to alert the king without being dismissed or accused of jealousy. He watched the queen, noting the nights she left the royal chambers, the papers she examined by candlelight, and the guards who waited silently outside doors she entered. There was a method to her silence, a careful orchestration of influence. The children, innocent and unsuspecting, were beginning to feel the chill of her calculated distance, the first brush of a power struggle that would soon engulf them entirely. The king, still steeped in memories of his first queen, failed to see the growing storm until it whispered through the hallways, carried in the quiet acts of control the new queen executed without apology. What had begun as a gentle hand guiding a broken heart was turning into a slow, invisible siege, one measured in trust broken and loyalty tested. By the time the first month had passed, the servant had gathered enough to worry openly, though he knew speaking prematurely could endanger him. The new queen had already insinuated herself into every aspect of the court, choosing who would deliver messages, approving what trades occurred, and subtly influencing the king's decisions. She smiled, she bowed, she knelt, and she observed, each movement deliberate. The palace breathed under her control without a single loud act of tyranny, making her dangerous precisely because she remained unseen. The king, though cautious, trusted her because he wanted peace. He did not yet understand that this trust was precisely what made him vulnerable. And as the sun set behind the palace towers, the servant knew that the quiet threat they all felt, the threat of betrayal and ambition, would soon grow, forcing decisions no one was ready to make. The kingdom held its breath, and the first tremors of danger had only just begun. The kingdom held its breath, and the first tremors of danger had only just begun. The servant could no longer ignore the patterns he had observed, the quiet manipulation was becoming bolder. Late at night, he followed the new queen through twisting corridors, glimpsing the documents she hid beneath her robes and the guarded whispers exchanged with officials. Every move was calculated, every smile measured. She spoke of inheritance, succession, and power in a way that chilled him to the bone. The children, sensing unease but too young to understand politics, huddled together in their chambers, whispering fears they could not fully name. The palace had transformed from a place of laughter and light into a labyrinth of shadows and harsh schemes. The king, still mourning, remained unaware, trusting appearances over instinct, a mistake the servant knew could cost them all dearly. The first confrontation came subtly, like a storm appearing in a distant sky before thunder. The servant attempted to warn the king, presenting small but undeniable evidence of the queen's manipulations. He spoke of reduced allowances for the children, of forged documents and whispered threats meant to force them to relinquish their inheritance. The king listened, his heart heavy, but grief had dulled his judgment. He saw only a loyal servant, perhaps overly anxious, and a queen whose manners and devotion seemed sincere. The queen, sensing the growing suspicion, moved quickly to undermine him. She whispered in the king's ear that the servant's loyalty was tainted by jealousy, planting seeds of doubt in the grieving mind of a ruler still fragile from loss. Her words were soft, almost musical, but they carried the sharpness of poison, and the king's eyes, clouded by sorrow, began to waver. Meanwhile, the children felt the tightening grip of their stepmother's influence. Once playful and carefree, they were now cautious, fearful of every glance, every gesture. Meals were eaten silently, gifts no longer arrived on birthdays, and their beds were often left cold as if the warmth of love had fled. The eldest child tried to protect the younger ones, but the queen's watchful eyes ensured that even whispered words of comfort were carefully monitored. At night, in the flickering torchlight of their chambers, they spoke in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the fear and confusion. The servant moved among them like a shadow, offering comfort and reassurance where he could, but each night he returned to the empty corridors, haunted by the thought that the palace's walls themselves were conspiring against them. Every secret step he took seemed to place him one heartbeat closer to discovery and one heartbeat closer to danger. The palace itself had become a place of tension, where each corridor echoed with uncertainty. Officials who once served with pride now tiptoed around hidden alliances and whispered conversations. The queen had begun to bribe scribes and trusted advisors, ensuring that no record remained that could later be used against her. Every meeting in the council chambers carried a subtle shift of power. Her voice, though quiet, dominated discussions, steering decisions in her favor. The servant witnessed these manipulations with a growing sense of dread, knowing that the king's blindness left the kingdom vulnerable. Even those loyal to the crown could not match the queen's cunning, for she had learned to weaponize silence, to make shadows speak in place of men. The court, once a theater of justice and celebration, had become a stage for deceit, and the audience, the king himself, was unaware he had been cast in a role of ignorance. As weeks turned into months, the servant's concern grew urgent. He observed how the queen forced the children into oaths they could not fully comprehend, pledges to surrender their rightful claims under threat and persuasion. He saw her in private chambers, arranging falsified documents and securing signatures of compliance from reluctant officials. She measured every action, every glance, ensuring her rise to power remained unchallenged. The king, preoccupied and weary, remained a distant observer of his own kingdom, caught in the fog of grief and trust. Only the servant's vigilance prevented the first true acts of betrayal from reaching their deadly conclusion. And yet, the more he watched, the more he understood that knowledge alone would not protect the family. A plan would be needed, one that could reveal the queen's true nature without endangering the lives of the innocent. The servant knew the time was approaching when secrecy and patience would collide, and when the palace's long-held facade of peace would shatter under the weight of ambition. A plan was forming in the servant's mind, a plan that required courage the likes of which he had never known. The queen's manipulations were no longer subtle. She had begun openly threatening the children, forcing them to swear away what little claim they had to the kingdom. Yet the king remained distant, wrapped in the remnants of grief and blinded by trust. The servant realized that any direct confrontation would fail. The queen's web was too intricate, her charm too convincing. If the truth were to emerge, it had to be witnessed, undeniable, and undeniable in a way that would leave no room for the queen's lies. He whispered these fears to himself each night, pacing the shadowed halls, wondering how to protect the heirs without betraying the trust of the king he had served for decades. And then, one evening, as the wind carried the scent of distant rains through the palace, an idea took root, a terrifying, brilliant notion that would test every ounce of patience, loyalty, and courage he possessed. The king, weary and suspicious but still sharp beneath layers of sorrow, listened as the servant cautiously outlined the queen's activities. The servant described the secret meetings, the falsified documents, the threats whispered to children too young to resist, and the subtle control she had asserted over the palace staff. At first, the king's grief-clouded mind refused to see the magnitude of betrayal. Could the woman before him, composed and demure, capable of tender gestures in public, truly be so dangerous? But as the servant spoke, recounting what he had observed firsthand, and as small details aligned with incidents the king had ignored, the fog began to lift. The king's mind, once dulled by sorrow, sharpened, and he understood that if he acted openly, the queen would hide the truth, destroy evidence, and claim innocence. A secret plan had to unfold, one that allowed him to observe, unchallenged, the treachery that surrounded his throne. The idea came with risk so great it made the servant tremble. The king would feign death. According to ancient customs, the monarch's body would be preserved in a glass coffin for 2 days, allowing the spirit of the king to linger over the palace. During this time, all who moved and spoke within the court would be observed as if the king were a silent witness. The queen, confident in her cunning, would act as she had in private, revealing her true intentions without suspicion. The servant's role was crucial. He would feed, water, and care for the king in secret, remaining the unseen guardian while the palace revealed its hidden faces. Fear intertwined with hope in the servant's chest, knowing that if discovered, both their lives could end in an instant. Yet, he accepted the peril, driven by loyalty and the knowledge that the innocent, children too young to defend themselves, depended on them. The palace, once a cage of quiet deceit, would become the stage where truth, cunning, and patience collided. During the 2 days of observation, the queen's duplicity unfolded with terrifying clarity. She summoned the children individually, whispering threats so subtle yet so powerful that even the elders felt compelled to obey. She instructed palace officials to prepare false documents transferring inheritance rights, ensuring that her own children, as she claimed, would rise in position and power while the others were left powerless. She balked at spending even a fraction of the kingdom's wealth on the funeral arrangements, her eyes cold, calculating, as if mourning itself were an expense to be minimized. Servants who had once served loyally were now compelled into complicity through fear or bribery. The palace echoed with whispered negotiations, secret alliances, and the careful orchestration of deceit. Through the transparent walls of the coffin, the king saw it all, the greed, the manipulation, the cruelty, and felt a rage unlike any he had known, tempered only by the need to protect those he loved. Every act, every word, every shadowed step was catalogued in his mind, a record of the queen's ambition laid bare. Through it all, the servant remained steadfast, moving silently through the palace corridors, ensuring the king's survival while keeping watch over the children. He brought water to the glass coffin, adjusted blankets, whispered encouragement to the young heirs hiding in their chambers, and, most importantly, reminded himself of the stakes. The queen's confidence grew, believing her power absolute, her cunning unmatched, unaware that every step she took was observed by the very monarch she sought to deceive. The first day passed with quiet tension, the second with an almost unbearable intensity, as each act of manipulation built toward the inevitable revelation. And then, as the hour of the queen's coronation approached, she moved forward with arrogance, certain of her triumph. It was at that moment that the glass coffin would open, the king would emerge, and the palace, the council, and the people would witness the unraveling of deception in full. Loyalty, patience, and courage, the unseen forces of two lives intertwined, would finally bring justice, and the kingdom would confront the raw truth of ambition and betrayal. Loyalty, patience, and courage, the unseen forces of two lives intertwined, would finally bring justice, and the kingdom would confront the raw truth of ambition and betrayal. The hour of the queen's coronation arrived with the sun barely peeking over the palace towers, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The court gathered in silence, unaware that the king, thought dead, watched from within the glass coffin. The queen moved confidently among the nobles, her robes trailing like a dark river of intent, her voice calm as she issued commands and accepted congratulations. Officials who had once feared the servant now bowed to her authority, believing her ascendancy inevitable. Yet beneath her composure lay a fragile arrogance. She had underestimated the king's resolve and the servant's unwavering loyalty. Every movement she made, every word she whispered, was observed by eyes that had once adored her grace but now saw her true form, cunning, cruel, and entirely self-serving. As the queen raised her hand to signal the beginning of her coronation ceremony, the glass coffin was opened. A collective gasp tore through the courtyard, and a wave of shock swept across the faces of nobles, courtiers, and palace guards alike. The king stepped forward, alive and whole, his presence a thunderclap of authority and revelation. Silence fell, broken only by the whispers of fear and disbelief. The queen froze, her carefully constructed composure shattering in an instant. Eyes that once commanded obedience now darted in panic, realizing that every act of deceit had been witnessed. The children, previously huddled in fear, emerged from their hiding, their faces pale but resolute. The servant, ever vigilant, stood nearby, a quiet witness to the turning of fate. The king's gaze, steady and piercing, swept across the courtyard, taking in the faces of those who had aided her and those who had been complicit through silence. The moment was more than triumph, it was a reckoning. Evidence of her betrayal was laid bare for all to see. The king presented the falsified documents she had orchestrated, read aloud her threats to the children, and recounted the manipulations of officials she had coerced or bribed. The people, once deceived by her outward charm, now gasped in collective realization. Even the most loyal advisers, who had feared the consequences of speaking out, found their voices, confirming the queen's schemes and recounting her calculated cruelty. The queen tried to protest, to claim innocence, but her words fell like ash in the wind, powerless against the undeniable weight of truth. The children stepped forward, voicing the fear and uncertainty they had endured, their small voices carrying the weight of revelation. The servant, whose unwavering vigilance had made this exposure possible, was honored silently with a nod from the king, a recognition deeper than words. Justice had arrived not through confrontation alone, but through patience, courage, and the careful gathering of truth. With the queen imprisoned and her powers stripped away, the palace breathed again. The king knelt before his children, taking each hand in turn, offering apologies for the suffering they had silently endured. Tears mingled with smiles as the family, once fractured by fear and deceit, began the slow work of reconnection. The throne, once a symbol of authority and isolation, was no longer a barrier between ruler and people. The king chose humility over grandeur, recognizing that true leadership came not from fear, but from presence, protection, and empathy. Meals were shared in communal spaces, laughter tentatively returned to the corridors, and the palace, once cold and tense, began to feel like home again. The servant remained a steady presence, guiding the children and ensuring that the lessons of vigilance and loyalty were never forgotten. In the final hours of the day, the king sat among the people, without crown or ceremonial robes, sharing food and conversation with those he had sworn to protect. The children laughed freely, their innocence restored, and the palace gates opened wide, welcoming citizens who had once feared silence as a tool of power. The queen's absence was a lesson, a stark reminder that ambition unchecked by morality brings ruin not only to individuals but to entire families and kingdoms. The king's voice, calm and firm, addressed those gathered. Power, he said, can blind even the wisest. But patience, loyalty, and truth endure beyond deceit and greed. The story of betrayal, courage, and revelation would be remembered not for the queen's ambition, but for the resilience of a family, the unwavering loyalty of a servant, and a king who dared to see the truth through shadows and patience. The kingdom, finally at peace, learned that justice often waits quietly, unseen, until those who serve with courage bring it to light.